Hello, everybody, and an enormously warm welcome on behalf of both Live Canon and the AP GRD at Oxford University. My name's Helen Eastman, and I'll be hosting today's reading. I am the Director of Live Canon and an Artistic Associate of the AP GRD, so it gives me enormous pleasure to host today's poetry reading because my work sits at the crossroads of contemporary poetry and classics. This is the first in what we hope will be a series of readings which bring together contemporary poets and classicists, and an opportunity for us to hear work in progress, new work, and to share ideas and thoughts across that liminal boundary. Today's poetry reading isn't subtitled because if you use auto subtitling on a live poetry reading, it can sometimes be a little bit comic, Zoom's interpretation of what you might be reading. But if you'd like to watch this again or you're watching it on catch up, there will be subtitles in YouTube, which we'll get up as soon as we can after the live reading. So do, if you want to check back in to read it, to watch with subtitles, those will be available later on. A warm welcome to everyone who is watching all over the place on YouTube. It's obviously really gutting that we can't all be together in one place meeting at the moment, but the only upside of having to do everything on Zoom is that people can tune in from all over the world. So there's something particularly special about a poetry reading where people are watching from all over the place. So thank you. At the end of the reading, there's going to be a chance to ask questions and for a bit of chat. You can post your questions into YouTube and into the discussion box on YouTube, and they'll be relayed across to me by the brilliant Claire at the AP GRD. And if for any reason you don't want to log into YouTube and therefore can't post a comment, you can just send an email to the AP GRD, apgrd@classics.ox.ac.uk, and that question will get relayed across to me as well. We've got 4 spectacular poets reading today, all of whom are working in different ways and at different stages in their creative process with classical material. What holds this reading together is that everyone is engaging in some way with classical myth or classical literature and taking those ideas in new direction. It plays into the bigger questions that those of us in classical reception are always asking about why we come back again and again and again to the same stories, and also for those of us working in poetry about what this obsession is, returning to some of the old stories as an essential part of our way of communicating. It's been particularly interesting to see the new work that's come out of the extraordinary times of the last year as well, and there's some of that we're going to be sharing today. So on we go. Our first poet who will be reading today is Maia Elsner. I'm a massive fan of her work, and I've been on a sort of strange stalking process over the last few years of gradually reading and watching more and more of her work and engaging with her on social media. Her work is always brilliant, lyrical, always sitting at the cross-section of lots of different disciplines. And it's always really exciting to discover what she is up to in any given moment. Maia was born in London to Mexican and Polish Jewish parents. She began writing poems in Massachusetts, USA, when she was the Henry Fellow at Harvard. Her debut collection, Overrun by Wild Boars, will be published by Flipped Eye in summer 2021, so look out for that. It's out soon and I can't wait. Recent poems have appeared in Poetry Island, Tinderbox, The Maine Review, among others. Her work's been anthologized in Un Nuevo Sol, British LatinX Writers, Field Notes on Survival from Bad Betty Press, and the Live Canon 2020 Anthology, and Crossing Lines, an Anthology of Immigrant Poetry from Broken Sleep Books. She's currently working on a collaborative poetry film project and translating Latin American writers into English, but she's here today. She's here today to share with us some of the work that intersects with the classics. So over to Maia, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Helen, for that really kind introduction. I'm so pleased to be here, so thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to share today a couple of experiments in form that are an attempt to grapple with ekphrasis. So these poems are written in 3 columns and can be read 2 ways, across or down, which is partly my way of trying to think through the ways that myth has been refracted, reinvented and repurposed, as well as the multiple versions that are available. For instance, how Euripides changes the fate of Helen in his play of the same name and changes the fate of Iphigenia in Iphigenia among the Taurians. I use this form because I wanted partly also to reflect on how we deal with fragmentation in the incompleteness of what survives, as well as translation between languages and between text and image. My first poem is called, for instance, Lucrece, and it includes one line in Shakespeare's The Rape of Lucrece, which comes at the moment in Shakespeare's long poem where Lucrece sees the tapestry of the Trojan War and fixates on Hecuba's sorrowful face. As Hecuba's sadness enables Lucrece to give voice to her own suffering, so she becomes Hecuba's speaking vessel. The poem I'm about to read explores a much more negative form of looking, and I'm going to, for the purposes of this event, read horizontally, but hopefully I'll screen share so you can have a sense of what the poems feel like read vertically as well. So let me see if this will work. Okay, hopefully you can see that. For instance, Lucrece, undone according to convention, searching desperate through bejeweled hallways of gold-spun narrative for a means to mourn, critics scrutinizing, form ignoring her violation, aesthetics, internal para-rhyme, the dactyl inserted, couplets with the voyeur's gaze, making three, spectator penetrating meaning, assimilating himself as Tarquin, scopophilic analysis as art historian, then celebrating Titian's naked spectacle, the titillating curtain, rude cover coming off, divine revelation, breasts heaving, beauty's rack, in the Fitzwilliam Museum, almost stabbed, in Botticelli, already dead. Dürer paints her in the same pose as Eve, damned, only once daggered, destroyed is she, mourned and loved. Thank you so much. To continue the theme of looking at paintings and writings through the prism of myth, I'm going to read a poem in 3 sections called After Auden's Musée des Beaux-Arts. The first part includes some lines from the Auden poem, which is an ekphrastic description of this very famous painting, Bruegel's Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. And the second and third part of this poem kind of take from writers who reuse the Icarus myth, and in some cases take directly from the Auden poem. Elements of these poems can be seen as found in the sense that they include quotation, which is itself a normal ancient poetic form, as in the Cento, with made up of lines from Homer and Virgil. My work often explores dislocation, both in terms of the people who migrate and the objects that are strewn across borders and take on new meanings as a result of being extracted from their original context and placed in communication with a new sets of norms, traditions, belief systems, and signifiers. I'm really interested in how we keep returning to the same stories that we know so well in order to comment on our present, or in Auden's case, not comment. After Auden's Musée des Beaux-Arts, 1. Published in 1940. Something amazing. Already Poland ravaged, and the poet walks dully along. Renata taken, Cecilia taken. Amid all of this, Yannick. Where is Yannick? The gypsies on the plains, annihilated, and meanwhile, Auden focuses on a painting of an expensive, delicate ship. Passing, not an important failure. The people on the shore busy, ignoring the splash, airstrike, the ploughman not recognizing a boy falling out the sky, legs disappearing, feathers into foam. Where is Yannick, reduced again to ekphrasis, while the politician talks about statistics and the reporters film drowning? 2. The way we plough through life. In Icarus again, writes Devonish, you'd think we'd have enough of falling, enough of myth and theory, particularly Eurocentric vision. How long will Greek be assumed universal? Kantara says, the whole Aegean not wide enough to hold the impact of death. Today, Icarus is a refugee dumped along the journey because tragedies happen. Icarus is everything you want her to be. A civil war slays her, says Coleman. Loose as feathers, fallen woman, made metaphor through history. 3. When lifted to the summit of the world, trade center, according to Certeau. You become an Icarus, flying above the waters, precarious nature of success, night flight New York, the warplanes dropping flares, tallying boy loving the sun, plunging like Leonardo, engraved into pale evening, scheming towards wings, an alchemy, corrupt and burning, all rotted into war is Reichheis's take, bubbles slowly blooming, white bombs and Auden's poem, September 1, 1939, retrospectively prophetic proclaims blind skyscrapers, the strength of collective man, now disintegrating in the ruins, bodies accumulating in the newsflash on US public radio. And to finish, I'm just going to read this last poem again, but vertically to get a sense of how that sounds different. 3. When lifted to the summit, according to Certeau, precarious nature dropping flares like Leonardo scheming towards wings, all rotted into white bombs, retrospectively, the strength of the ruins of the world. You become an Icarus of success, night flight New York, tallying boy loving the sun, engraved an alchemy. War is Reichheis's take. And Auden's poem, prophetic, proclaims collective man, bodies accumulating in the trade center, flying above the waters, the warplanes plunging into pale evening, corrupt and burning, bubbles slowly blooming, September 1, 1939. Blind skyscrapers now disintegrating in newsflash on US public radio. Thank you so much for listening, everybody.
Thank you so much, Maia. That was absolutely fabulous. And I know that there's lots of people over on YouTube applauding thunderously. It's very strange reading poetry on Zoom because you're reading into a complete void. And so I'm incredibly grateful to the generosity of all of our poets for reading. That was absolutely fascinating and an incredible reception, both of the myths within the text, but also of the fragmentary form. And I know that loads of people are going to be absolutely fascinated with what you're doing there, both in terms of content and in terms of playing with those structures and that fragmentation. And if you watch it back, the reading, obviously you'll be able to pause it and read the poems in every possible direction when they appear on the screen, which will be an added treat of being able to watch again. So thank you so much, Maia, for starting us off so brilliantly. Our second poet today is Laura Theus. Laura grew up in Germany and moved to the UK a decade ago, and she writes poems, stories, and songs in her second language, which I have such unfathomable respect for. It's extraordinary achievement. I had the privilege of directing a couple of films of Laura's poetry, which are on the Live Canon YouTube channel, and I've been an enormous fan of her work for some time. Her debut poetry collection, How to Extricate Yourself, came out recently from Dempsey and Windle, and it was selected as the winner of the 2020 Brian Dempsey Memorial Prize by the Poetry Society's Paul McGrain. It's a beautiful book. Her work's been widely anthologized, and it appears in a variety of literary journals, from Strange Horizons to Dyslexia, and she's been published in the UK, Ireland, Belgium, Germany, Canada, and the US. She's a recipient of the A.M. Heath Prize and has also won the Hammond House International Literary Award for Poetry and the 2020 Mogford Short Story Prize. She was highly commended for the 2020 Acumen Poetry Prize and the 2020 Jeff Stevens Memorial Prize, as well as being a finalist in over 20 other international literary competitions. So we are incredibly grateful to have her with us today, providing a truly bilingual international perspective on some of the questions we're facing, and writing in her second language, engaging with ancient myths. So thank you very much, Laura.
Thank you so much, Helen. And Maia, I really, really loved your poetry. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, so the first poem I'm reading is from the book that Helen mentioned, How to Extricate Yourself. And it's called Medusae. Medusae. Do not lose faith on the day you wake up with spiders instead of hair. Do not cry as you look in the mirror. Remember, they may stay, they may not. They are here for now. If you must take pains to cover your head, hide there crawling under your most elegant hat, lest people recoil from you in the streets. Or don't. Remember Medusa and her snakes. She'd turn anyone to stone if they looked at her frightened. She was a monster and proud. All hiss, curse, and scorn. Danger. And yet to think that someone must have loved her enough to name half of all jellyfish, those moon-glowing blooms of floating fluorescent umbrellas and bells, after her. So that was Medusa from the book, and now the other two poems I'm going to read are newer, so they're not in the book yet. So I'm reading from my screen. I hope that works. Okay, so the next one I'm reading is one that was commissioned by Helen. So she's really the reason it exists, and it's called 6 Things Saijita Had to Learn Without Being Taught. How to scream. As a doe, you have no voice to speak of, but you can still make a soft snorting noise when alarmed. You may even still sing when in love, a kazoo rasp crossed with a rusty screen door in the wind. How to be beautiful while unconscious. Don't. It isn't safe. How to be a moon. Be fallow, elusive, but as sharp as a shard of a god's heart. Know the meaning of fawning. Make sure you aren't followed. Here, and then gone. How to rest. Fold all 4 legs into a nest of moss under the hazel branches, or slow dance along the night sky with your sisters. Learn what you can from the comets. Anyone who knows what it means to be hounded knows how to be a star. How to be an offering. Transform incompletely, even when slain and presented to your goddess. Continue to exist, to be chased once again, here, and then gone. If they can always find you, you learn about light speed. One step and jump away from somebody's violent craving, you are smart enough to know. Losing yourself and finding a cervid is almost a relief. Even before all this, you saw what it means to be wearing horns of gold. How to hunt and be hunted at the same time. The stars understand it's never easy to tell the prey from the goddess. The goddess advises you need to be fast. You need to be less of yourself than everyone else. Only this will help you be quicker, A, on your feet, B, than him and his lightning. Ask all 6 of your sisters. Remember the wisdom of comets. Here, and then gone. Okay, and my third poem is called The Sirens Secret. So yeah, it's inspired by the myth of the sirens and how they came to be sirens. Love flies and love wounds. So that's why once upon a time, we were all wings and claws. Picture, if you can, a gaggle of us, part virgins, part birds, racing zephyr far above the ocean, happy, laughing, almost too breathless to sing. I know. You wouldn't think it to look at us now, would you? Now that we're only fangs and fins and yearning, featherless and sea-bound. Our old name has been taken from us, and we have been given another, a name we are forced to share with the world's most despised sounds, air raid whales and ambulances. Yes, we will sing for you. It was the Queen's doing all of this. Maybe it was jealousy, because we sang too loudly, laughed too much. Our stomachs lurched when she came to us smiling, with Calliope and her sisters in tow. We knew then. It was too late. They were upon us in seconds. 6 held us down, while the other 3 plucked at our plumes one by one, then threw us down into the sea. They laughed as we screamed and waved at us with their hands full of our beloved feathers. They made crowns out of them. They wear them on stage to this day. Poseidon saw us fall and took pity. He gave us our tails and the clamshell that now hides the song that is our secret. Don't worry. Once you've heard us sing, you'll know. Just not for long. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for an absolutely gorgeous reading. That was an absolute privilege to listen to. Thank you so much. And thank you for reading that second poem, which, as Laura mentioned, was commissioned indeed by Live Canon as part of a project where we invited 13 female poets to write poems celebrating or exploring the women in Pindar who are completely voiceless in Pindar's work. Often they only get a few lines mentioned, often to be rather euphemistically raped by a god, and that's their lot. And we spent some time with 13 brilliant poets creating work inspired by those women in the Pindaric odes. We're hoping that's going to become a pamphlet that'll be coming out quite soon, so I'll keep you posted on that. So thank you very much for sharing that, Laura, and the other work. And as I said, do get your hands on Laura's collection that she read from in the first poem. It's such an exquisite book. I've dipped back into it loads of times. It's a perfect one to keep on your bedside table. So our third poet today is Fahad Al-Amoudi, who I in fact met in a workshop for Malika's Poetry Kitchen when we were looking at techniques for reading poems, and suddenly he read this astonishing poem about Python. And some of you might know that I've had a sort of residing interest in the myth of Python, and exactly this time last year when the world closed down, I was with Alex Silverman at the composer, and we were at the University of British Columbia in Canada working with some students on a film inspired by the fragments of Euripides' Python. And I thought I was the only person in the world with that ongoing an interest in this myth. And then Fahad told me that he'd had a relationship with this myth since childhood, and he was trying to write about it, and I became incredibly excited. So I'm absolutely delighted that he's going to read that poem for us today. Fahad is a poet of Ethiopian and Yemeni heritage. He's based in London. His work's been published in Poetry London and the Macmillan anthology Slam, edited by Nikita Gill. He's recently collaborated with the Barbican Young Poets on English Heritage's Untold Stories, Unravelling the Threads project, and he has performed his poetry across the UK, Ethiopia and Sweden. He's an alumnus of the inaugural Obsidian Foundation, a Roundhouse finalist, and, as I mentioned, a member of Malika's Poetry Kitchen, an incredible collective of poets. So I'm absolutely delighted to hand over him to read his poem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen, for the introduction, and for the APGRD for having me in this reading. And thank you to Laura and Maia for your poems earlier. They were absolutely stunning and beautiful. Thank you for sharing. And I'd love to read them after the event. So yeah, as Helen said, singular poem for me today, all about Python. And yeah, I've had a relationship with the myth since I was a child, and I picked up Olivia Coolidge's collection of myths and just ravaged through them. And yeah, I've always been inspired, but I've never tried to write inspired by any kind of mythology before until recently in the Obsidian Foundation course. And I thought I'd give it a go and see what happens. So is it all right if I share my screen?
Of course it is, yeah.
Just gonna do that. Of the burnt skin, an Ethiopian myth. Here Phaethon lies, who in the sun god's chariot fed, and though greatly he failed, more greatly he dared. And like the boys before him, bruised and spectral, lamenting his mother in search of his father's palace, he marked the clay, dividing the poet from his people as the sun divided the land. He cut his shadow off by its ear with a dull knife, bloodletting seas, a ritual in service of silence. Had they known what he'd become, they might have called him beautiful, his winged foot, a point on the horizon, bursting with light. In his parents' birthplace, they found him of the burnt skin, against the crest in the road, with thoughts of paradise. His stillborn siblings, now poplar trees, who reunite him with his shadow. He welcomes them both with the same precision. He has his mother's eyes, a smile baring teeth around the city's edge, and like the boys before him, he discards prayer for song, carrying the garland of names with the devotion of a crown. Thank you. That's it from me. And
thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing that. We really appreciate it. The sharing of work in progress, I hope very much might become a part of this series so that conversations and discussions can happen while work's still being worked on, as opposed to those conversations happening further down the line. So I'm really grateful to Fahad for coming and sharing that. I also think that poem is structurally fascinating. I don't know if anyone else saw, but it's one long sentence, and something about that is so intrinsic to the perpetuousness, is that the right word? The perpetuity of motion in that story and that myth, that I think it's formally incredibly exciting as well. So maybe it'll also inspire some more people to engage with that particular myth and that story, and we'll have a flowering of Python poems, a whole book of Python poems, in fact. I can see one in the AP GRD speech. So thank you very much. Our final poet who's reading today is Glyn Maxwell, with whom Life Canon has had the privilege of collaborating in many ways and many forms over the years. Glyn is a poet, playwright, novelist, librettist, and critic. His volumes of poetry include How the Hell Are You, Breakage, Hide Now, and Pluto, all of which have been shortlisted for either the Ford or the T.S. Eliot Prizes, and The Nerve, which won the Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize. His selected poems, 1000 Nights and Counting, was published on both sides of the Atlantic in 2011. On Poetry is his guidebook for the general reader about poetry, and it was published in 2012. The Spectator called it a modern classic, and The Guardian described it as the best book about poetry I've ever read. I think I concur. I endlessly recommend it to everyone who may be thinking about writing poetry in any serious way, or reading poetry, critiquing poetry. So it's an absolute pleasure to have Glyn with us. Glyn has continuously come back to working with Greek mythology throughout his writing career, both in plays and in poetry. And I'm absolutely delighted that he's going to be sharing some of that with us today. So over to Glyn. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. Everything that I do with Live Canon is a joy, and this particularly is, and I'm delighted and proud to be reading with Laura and Maia and Fahad. It's really a wonderful thing to be invited to do, and specifically to be told which poems to read. That was particularly because it took away a lot of the effort. Helen and I were part of a group of creative people working on over various years on and off on a play called After Troy, which was a sort of conflation of Euripides' plays, The Trojan Women and Hecuba, in which mostly I wanted to take on the five major characters, the Queen and the princesses, as they sat in the ruins and what happened to them. The one I became the most fascinated with was, unsurprisingly, perhaps Cassandra, and working out how to deploy Cassandra dramatically, how to do it. I came up with the thought that she would say things at the same time as other characters, because she knew what they were about to say. So this took quite a lot for the actress to do, but that's what we did, is that when Agamemnon came out with something, she said exactly the same words at the same time. So that was the sort of way in. But I gave a lot of thought to what it would be like to be Cassandra, who was, of course, is taken away by Agamemnon at the end. Alongside the various versions of this play, which culminated in a play called After Troy, but alongside the various iterations, that I started writing poems about her. And there's a series of poems here, which I'll read a few of, in which she describes what it's like to be visited by people while she's a prisoner in a cell in the ruins of Troy, and basically she's been set up as a sort of palmist or tarot reader, a sort of joke for the soldiers to come by and have a fortune teller. Of course, none of them believe her as it goes. This is a poem that ended up in a different play called Agamemnon Home. It's a sort of round rather like Fahad just had with that, the same sort of spiral thing, which seemed peculiarly appropriate. Cassandra's song. There was a world, and all it was all it was. And all it was green and blue against the black. And everyone will have a birthday. There was a world, and all it was all it was. And all it was green and blue against the black. And everyone will have a birthday. There was a world, and all it was all it was. And all it was green and blue against the black. And everyone will have a birthday. This is the first of the poems where she's visited. In the first instance, she's visited by two soldiers of the night watch who are drunk, you know. They send, Cassandra and the night watch, they send ahead their cackling like servants to say they're coming. Like I heard the ocean say a wave will break. I'm wide awake, like you are, tracing the glyph for now on my one cushion. They burst into my cell and cry, "It's us two, witch lady, look!" As if I caught the windstorm saying there'll be leaves. Between their graves, I dance with them. They have me twirling to their anthem. They tire like battles and they rest like cities, blue with heat. They hiss the candles out and grin at their burnt fingers. I say, "Sing us the song of what's to come," at the same time they say it. They listen like a sprawling black lagoon in the earth's last forest. They stir like it's TV. One talks in sleep like software. Sometime, somewhere. The other staggers towards me, desperate for me. On another occasion, she is visited by the king, Agamemnon. This is in her voice talking about this incident. I can't remember if this happened yet, but the king came in and cleared out all his pals and sat with everything akimbo and said, "Do the bit where I love you, little senorita, cut to it." So I told him what had happened, hadn't yet. And it was the longest time this man had ever sat for anything. He roared, "I now believe that bit." He wanted astonishment from me, so I went for it. I asked him if he'd got round to believing yet that he'd be slaughtered where he stood. "Or where I sat," he chuckled, and I sat corrected. "Just a bit," he murmured. "I'm the king, of course I'll swing for it. But I'm going to free you, girl." "I wouldn't do that yet," I said, and someone came and served us as we sat in lovely sunlight. Then he dozed a little bit, so I said, "Your wife will kill you." He said, "Go for it, mine angel." I do know, but didn't quite know yet if that meant her or me. My little black cat sat on Agamemnon's lap and bathed himself a bit. "She'll kill you in your bath." "Will you join me in it?" he giggled. "You will love me, sir," I said, "and yet you'll never have me. This is the last time we sat face to face, because you won't get it up." He bit his nails and stood. "You gypsy bitch, you don't know shit." This one is more general, it's shorter and more general. It's not about a particular visitation of anyone. It's a more general one, and it kind of references the first time I ever encountered anything about the Greek classics, which was in a colouring book as a small child. Cassandra by the Wall. I mean, this is written in the late 2000s. There's a little bit of 9/11 in it somewhere. I think I was living in America at the time. Cassandra by the Wall. Fire came and went, and soon. In my gripped eyes you soothe. You see twin flames and shush them. When it comes, your open eyes will show a crow's eye view, twin turrets burning with the eyeballs murders. It was long ago. It was yesterday. Next Wednesday. Guess which cup? You found me resting by my wall on one of my good days, eyes lowered and watching it happen before in the sand, happen in ant world. I don't even mention this in my mad politeness. I loom my face so close to all of you, great laughter is occasioned, like when I said your world would end up as a craning book for children. And in the last one, Cassandra visits me while I'm writing. And actually, weirdly, given this was written 15 years ago, gets it right. Gets it quite accurately right. Helen, thanks for asking me. And thanks for my fellow readers. It's beautiful to hear you guys, and thanks for everyone who's out there, invisible to me, listening, watching. This is just called Cassandra, and it's the last one I'm reading. So the you in the poem is me. You. I won't foresee for you one thing. You staring into space. You moulding creatures. You thinking if you stop it, then the world ends. Little old you, it does. Mine doesn't, yours will. But I won't foresee for you. You won't believe me. You rub your eyes and write. You've not believed life's anything but a grin into the mist for some time now, although you gasp at line breaks like something spoke to you. Oh, it spoke to you. I'm at your window now. I breathe the year you'll die on the warm glass. Beyond my wild hair, blossoms that are come, but you're so distracted, you, by my lips, my ways, you think like me. Wake with one face, a sniff away forever. Speak the lines she speaks at the moment she speaks these you speak, and set your lips where she does, then you'll see nothing, coming or becoming, and all will be so well. It will be well, but I won't let you hear that. If you hear it, you won't believe it. There's where our curses meet, like kisses. All will be well. You didn't hear it, you, therefore believe it, as your fingers whittle at the keys to the bright screen, as the window pane goes cold and I move on, trespassing away down your lawn, over the wall and out across farmland. That's Cassandra.
Thank you so much, Glenn. You're right. I did ask you what I wanted you to read, and you were very gracious in following that instruction. In that I knew that Glenn's writing had been punctuated by Cassandra poems throughout his career, and the opportunity of putting them all together and hearing them in one reading was just too tantalising. So thank you so much for doing that for us today. The opportunity to hear them all side by side is an absolute treat, and you can find them in various of Glenn's plays and various collections. Do get in touch with me if you want to know what comes from where, but actually it's really exciting to place them together and see them as a body of work. We're going to move on now to answering some questions, and if you are watching this and you would like to ask a question, you can type it into the chat on YouTube and it will get relayed across to me by Claire. Or if you would like to email the APGRD with a question, you can do that if you don't want to tune in and do it through the YouTube. But while those questions are starting to come across, I'm going to start with one of mine, which I think follows on a little bit from what I was just saying about Glenn's work, which is there's an idea floating in the ether that maybe writers all have one myth or one character that they just keep coming back to. And when Fahad said to me, for me it's always been Python, and I know Glenn, you've kept coming back to Cassandra. And I just wondered whether you agreed that somehow there's, often a myth that catches you and just keeps playing on repeat through your work. So I might start by asking that question to each of you, and start by asking Maia.
Thank you, Helen. That's an interesting question. I think I definitely have been obsessed with Icarus for some time. I think that has something to do with, I write a lot about kind of crossing the Atlantic Ocean. And so Icarus as the figure of the migrant doesn't make it has been quite important for me. But I do think I fall in love with different myths at different moments, depending on what I'm currently excited about. So I look forward to see which one is the next myth that becomes important to me. Thank you for the question.
Maybe they change as we go through life, what those myths are and which ones we reach for at different points in our journey. I'm thinking of those incredible letters and correspondence between Seamus Heaney and Ted Hughes, where Hughes writes about how he was endlessly looking for a myth to use to write about his relationship with Plath, and then he found Alcestis, and it was a moment of finding the myth that would allow him to put those emotions on paper. Laura, how do you feel about, is there one myth you keep coming back to, or are you always finding new ones?
I think what Maia said is really true, like it changes. And I think what I'm always drawn to is the idea of transformation. So any myth, and most of them have that in them, where any kind of metamorphosis happens, and people turn into animals or trees, or things turning into each other. I think that's what fascinates me, because that's really fun to write about, basically.
And that, I love how that idea of metamorphosis is so culturally pervasive at the moment in popular culture. To get a completely popular culture reference in, yesterday I witnessed my teenage son and various of his friends playing Dungeons and Dragons, and one of the girls said, "Oh yeah, I want to be the character that gets to turn into animals." There's a whole character type that gets to turn into them, and without really knowing it, they are just instinctively playing out all of those mythologies in new narratives every time they play, which was adamant that she should be the character that could, morph into different women. When we worked on the Pindar project with those new poems, we looked quite a lot about how you actually engage with women who are just fleetingly turned into animals in stories, and what that experience might be like. So thank you for engaging with that for us. And Fahad, is your story Python? Is that the one, or are there other ones that linger in your literary consciousness?
It's always been that story. I think you mentioned it before, the gaps in that myth are what's fascinating and what's always gripped me. I'm fascinated by the question of how Phaethon knew what he wanted to ask when he got to Apollo's gates. I know that seems like a sort of inane, dumb question, but that's sort of gripped me for many years now. I'll continue to keep playing and working through this myth.
And Glenn, is it always Cassandra, or are there other ones that have riffed through your life?
I think that there have been. I mean, there was that anthology when we were all young British poets, and we all had to do a myth, but we were allocated those, and I was allocated Phaethon, weirdly, which I thought was a personal insult of some kind. We were young, and we just took what we were given. With the Cassandra thing, I was just thinking about it, revisiting it. There was something about Agamemnon going into her cell with all the power and taking her for his slave. And dramatizing it, I thought it would be interesting if there was a spark between them. I mean, just weird and interesting. And I suppose it was partly because I realized after a while I was doing the same thing, and that I was Agamemnon because I had all the power as the writer, and that Cassandra was the object that I was fascinated by, but ultimately she would outlast me and would still be there, and I would have sort of burned myself out doing this. And I don't know, I felt that it was oddly parallel. So I think that's why I was really bewitched by it. Its constancy, her constancy, enabled me to do a kind of rounded Agamemnon with all, which was, I think, to some extent, a self-portrait. So with a lot of self-criticism.
That's a really interesting point about constancy. That what changes is us as creative artists responding to the myths, and in some ways, what is that true? That the source is. I suppose it's not true, because there are so many different versions of the myths. We don't have one consistent literary source for these stories, but to some extent, yes, those myths outlast us all, and we are just a momentary moment in their reception, I suppose, in terms of how we translate. There's some questions coming in. I'm going to go first for one from Clara, who's asked, what's the lockdown myth, do you think?
I have something that I could offer for this question. One. I was thinking maybe about Penelope unstitching her tapestry, partly because of the kind of paralysis, but also what it is to have all these pressures from the outside, if we think Penelope and the suitors, but in the context now of kind of so much tragedy for so long, and yet being in this state of paralysis where you can't go forward, you can't go back, and actually what the big limitation is, we can't be together. There can't be a collective mourning, there can't be a kind of collective sharing of experience. So that was just one thing I thought in response to that question.
Oh, that's a really good answer. Yeah, maybe Circe as well, like being trapped and isolated without, yeah, and having like rare visitors come. Yeah, but I think I prefer your one.
We've been thinking a little bit about Oedipus narratives in this context, because obviously that play and that story starts with plague and the idea that a whole community is blighted by illness and plague. In fact, I was looking this morning back at those images of the suffering city, and the idea that that's somehow being sent down upon us. And I think that's been very interesting to engage with, because on one level it gives us all that imagery of the sort of lockdown idea of a city under siege or a city under plague, but on the other hand, all the answers it offers are in some way spiritual and about cleansing, which if you're a secular contemporary writer is not really the directions you can find out of that narrative. I've been working a bit on Kay Tempest's, in fact, I wrote the literary translation for Kay Tempest's play based on Philoctetes, which is coming up at the National later in the year. And I've also felt that Philoctetes is a really keen story for this time in some ways, because it's the story of isolation, I suppose, and the story of how you come back. Certainly a Sophocles telling, not really the telling of it, but how we come back. Any thoughts, Glyn? What's been the one knocking around your head for lockdown?
No, it's a really good question, and there've already been good answers. And no, I've been thinking a bit about Ted Hughes ever since you mentioned him, and I don't know which of the myths this is, but I sort of feel his life was ruined by trying to find myths for things. I reviewed his biography, the Jonathan Bate one, and I think his life was ruined. I think so. It was a tragedy. So whatever myth that is, trying to find myth in your life wrecked his life. I honestly think that, but I don't want to get bogged down in that. So I just because he came up, and it's a very sad read, that his life as a biography is really sad, and it wrecked the work. So, anyway,
perhaps that's a note of caution for us all. Don't try and always view the present through the prism of mythology. There's a question. There's a question that's coming from Jill. It must be very difficult to find new ways to tell old stories. How do you do it? Because you have, and I think that's a really interesting question. How do you keep finding the new in the old? I'm going to back that one across to Fahad first, because I think you've done such an extraordinary job in that poem of finding the personal amongst the general, the new amongst the old. But I think you also mentioned to me that there was a Hutchinson poem that had really inspired you. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think that's a really interesting correlation.
Sure, yeah. So Ishion Hutchinson poem, Phaeton, I think what he wanted to do is he didn't want to kill Phaeton. He wanted Phaeton to find like a new consciousness in death. And it was really beautiful. And after I read it, I was haunted by it for weeks, months. And at the time I was writing this, I was also reading a lot of Carl Phillips, and he does some weird and wonderful things with syntax. So I basically had those two ideas I was playing around with, and I wanted to write this ode. And yeah, I think it's like a springboard for like further ways that I can reinterpret and fill in the gaps. But yeah, I mean, Ishion Hutchinson's poem is definitely worth a read. He does something really beautiful with the myth.
Yeah, that's a brilliant sort of answer to the question of where you find sometimes it's in the relationship between an old myth or an idea and a new poem or a new inspiration, that's something that when you triangulate those things, new inspiration comes. Also, I think there's something really interesting to say about irreverence, which is that in our new relationships with mythology, we don't have to be slavish to it. We can retell the stories in new and wildly irreverent ways. I'm thinking of in What Elements the Half God of Rainfall, which brings together the African gods and the Greek gods, and he suddenly realized there was no way forward in this story unless his matriarchal African gods basically killed off Zeus, which is obviously a fairly big rewrite of classical mythology, but the right thing for that narrative. We'll be interviewing him about that play a little bit later in this APGRD series, but actually irreverence, I think, is really important. I'm going to back that question across to Glyn, who perhaps is a king of irreverence. But coming back to Jill's question, how do you find new ways to tell old stories?
Well, I guess what I said about Cassandra being a constant. I mean, of course, there are differing sources for everything, but there's essentially a sort of consensus about the oldest versions, the oldest sources for all of these stories. And because they have a constancy, it's a way we measure our civilization by varying what we say about it. The way we do it is a way to take the temperature of the time, I suppose. And it feels like, it never feels like looking back. It always feels like looking more intensely at now. It never feels retroactive or retrospective to go back to old myths. I think, yeah, they essentially, only one party gets affected by the relationship, right? And that's us. And hopefully we can strike some serious sparks on the way. But we can't change these things. We can just say, here's what the world looks now in relation to them.
And obviously the position of who we are and where we reclaim those texts. Reclaim, is that the right word? Or engage with those texts from is entirely, it's International Women's Day, which feels an important to mention that, for example, the project that Laura and I were working on looking at female characters in Pindar was very much about saying, how do we revisit these stories from a different gender identity, a different cultural identity, and what happens when we engage different places with the same materials. And I'm really interested in also where we have those cultural collisions between different mythologies, which is obviously present in many of the other things that we've been talking about today. I've got another question for you, which is a little bit about empowerment, because sometimes people feel that engaging with classical texts in work can be disempowering to a reader. That if a poem is full of references, that somehow or other, and also that our cultural expectation about what people might or might not get, in terms of what people reading or background people might bring to the table. How do we make sure as writers that we engage with classics in a way that's empowering and accessible and isn't gatekeeping by excluding people by the use of knowledge of ancient canon? Just wondered if anyone had any thoughts about that.
Well, it's not recorded history, right? It's not certifiable history. So therefore there is always freedom around it. History is, you can see how history is being argued about every hour of the day in this country as it loses its nerve completely and crumbles to nothingness. It just squabbles over what its versions of history are, and it's sad but inevitable way to decline. Yeah, these are stories, whatever they came from, however they originated, they're stories, and we're storytellers. So we're not gatekeepers. We don't know anything. We're storytellers. We've got nothing to defend. Just got to do our work well.
Yeah, I like the idea of. I mean, I hope that's something that everybody feels, but you don't. It's not. You don't have to sort of be privy to some kind of refined or revered classical knowledge to be able to engage with this material, and that it's something for everybody. But I'm not sure that is always the case in terms of. And I think I worry quite a lot about making sure that that when work engages with the classics, excluded audiences. Is that perhaps sort of an overly concerned thing to worry about? But I think it's an interesting question in terms of what it does if there's, for example, you know, if a poem starts with a title like Medusa, most people probably have heard of Medusa, but perhaps it starts with a title maybe they haven't, so whether that is in any way off-putting. I was really amused by you saying that you thought you'd got the short straw assigned Python. I wonder whether when we did assign the women in Pindar to people, and I wonder if people felt they'd got short straws when they got ones that they hadn't heard the names of, but yet in some ways they were the ones who needed the most reclamation because they haven't reached the sort of popular consciousness of being regularly in myth. Maia, I was really interested in what you in terms of the work you do. You're obviously engaging with the form of ancient texts in terms of the fragmentation as well as the actual content. And I just before we finish, a sort of final question, which is what is there for us to mind that is not just about the stories, but about the way these ancient poems were told? There's obviously a new engagement with the idea of orality and the poet as storyteller. That's very becoming a much more important thing in our culture. But I just wondered if anyone had a few words on how they feel they've engaged with form as well as content in terms of engaging with tradition. Perhaps Maia better start on this one.
Thank you for your question. I think I'm really interested because kind of, I guess my work is between the kind of systematizing logic that often is quite violent. So the ways that, for instance, empire creates a kind of logical structure on the one hand, and on the other hand, the kind of, I guess, shards of history. And so to kind of use form in a way that explores that tension. So I've recently kind of been very interested in kind of how can you think about empire in a sonnet form or in a villanelle form, these kind of very old traditional, and then how can you break them, use kind of classical, very traditional myths that we all know and kind of slash them open, as it were, on the page, and kind of using that as kind of maybe a productive way to think about margins, peripheries, silenced histories, what are the gaps, how do you fall through the columns, as it were, into the space that has not been recorded so obviously. I think I'll stop there for now.
No, that was a brilliant smashing open in a really brilliant way of that question in terms of the idea of smashing open forms and seeing what we can find within them, as well as this very vivid image, as well as just narratives in terms of how we can interact. And obviously there's been some really interesting retellings of the epic poems recently where people have really tried to engage with that form and what that might be. Are there any other thoughts on that?
Well, I was struck by the formal experiments you guys have been doing, and I realised that, well, I mean, most of what I do is formal anyway, so I'm not really a good example of what choices to make when you approach classical material. But I would think there's something about strong form, a challenging form, whether it's, like you say, a villanelle or a sonnet, like a surviving ancient form, or whether it's a like you say, the columns, like it's quite a new form, or a slightly crumbled version of an old form, like a ruin of the antiquity. I think the shadow of form, it's good if I think we're drawn to make things quite formal, or to see the ghost of a form in it, because if a poem is formal, then you're sort of playing chords, you're lifting up the lyre, and you're playing the thing. It's got to be high, tight strung so that it kind of plays down the ages. It can't really be the prose confessional of the moment, right? Because what you say supplies the moment. So I think the form maybe has to supply the antiquity in some way, or at least a crumbled form of it has to supply the antiquity.
And perhaps is that a little bit generational as well, in terms of how we as different generations, because obviously there was a sort of phase in the 70s and 80s of quite a lot of confessional poems that tried to engage with the interior lives of characters from ancient I'm thinking of the sort of long Atwood and Stevie Smith poems trying to get inside Helen's head, and you know, those sort of interior, and actually maybe we've come a little bit past that stage, and now we're re-engaging with the idea of those forms beyond the psychology of the characters. It's a really, really interesting question, one that I hope we can talk about much more. I've realised that we are about to finish our indulgence of an hour of getting to talk about these massive questions, and I want to make sure I've got time to thank you all enormously, both for reading and for being happy to come and chat about your work and these bigger questions. As I said, I hope that will become a series of conversations that we can have with contemporary poets working in this way, which will be of benefit to all of us in this space between the ancient and the modern, the old, the now, and the different perspectives we want to bring to these questions. But it has, above all, just been an enormous, enormous treat to get to hear all four of you read today. So thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who is watching, wherever you're watching from, whether you're watching live or whether you're watching this and catching up. And if you are interested in all of these questions, the APGRD has an incredible repository of knowledge, of texts, of directions in which to go, of things to read, watch and study within its archive. So you're in no better place to start to consider these questions. So I get to say a massive thank you on behalf of both Life Canon and the APGRD, with both of my double-horned hats on. So thank you very, very much to all four of you, and I hope that this is a conversation we can continue. So Glyn, Fahad, Laura and Maia, thank you.